cardiac death, fatal and non-fatal heart attacks, and non-fatal coronary heart disease events, even when added on top of low-dose statins, which in theory should have already reduced the subject's risk for these outcomes. In a cohort of Japanese patients who'd already experienced a major CHD event or stroke, EPA supplementation led to a 19% reduction in major CHD events and a 20% reduction in recurrent stroke. And remember, this study was done in Japan, where the usual diet is already pretty high in omega-3. The additional omega-3 seemed to benefit heart health even more. In a more recent study, the Diet and Omega-3 Intervention Trial, DOIT, a placebo-controlled trial in over 500 Norwegian men, those receiving an omega-3 supplement about 2 grams of EPA-DHA per day, showed a 47% reduction in all-cause mortality, suggesting that EPA and DHA may reduce mortality in those who have never had a cardiovascular problem, and that even if you haven't had a heart attack, consuming 2 to 4 grams of EPA-DHA may help you live longer. Taken as a whole, research on omega-3s for heart health indicates that these special fats are beneficial for the heart and cardiovascular system in people who have never had a cardiovascular problem, as well as in those who have. Real deal dietary advice. Thanks to the 2015 U.S. dietary guidelines, industrial seed oils now have their own category as part of a healthy eating pattern. Currently, all Americans are recommended to consume up to 27 grams of industrial seed oil per day, around 5 teaspoons. This advice will more likely increase chronic disease, including heart disease and cancer. We recommend an alternative, our cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. A cyclical ketogenic diet consists of an initial phase of inducing metabolic flexibility through the use of a low-carb, low-protein, and high-fat diet until one burns ketones, which could vary from 2 to 8 weeks. Once metabolic flexibility is achieved and one has the ability to burn fat as a healthy fuel, then healthy carbohydrates are used in addition to higher protein 2 to 3 days per week, typically on days that one is using strength training. Table 1.1 provides a comparison of the recommendations in the 2015 dietary guidelines regarding a healthy eating pattern and a recommended alternative based on the data detailed in this chapter. Table 1.1 2015 dietary guidelines, healthy eating pattern versus our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. 2015 dietary guidelines eating pattern. Grains, at least half of which are whole grains. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Avoid refined grains entirely and even most whole grains. Instead, consume more natural, nutrient-dense foods such as organic grass-fed, non-CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operations, meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. 2015 Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Vegetables and fruits. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Organic, preferably locally grown vegetables and fruits, the latter in moderation. Reach for the more bitter types of fruit, like berries. 2015 Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Fat-free or low-fat dairy. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Consume organic grass-fed, non-CAFO animal foods as close to nature as possible, including full-fat or whole milk dairy products. Fat-free and low-fat versions often come with added sugar and may increase hunger. 2015 Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Protein foods, seafood, lean meats, and poultry, eggs, legumes, and nuts, seeds, and soy products. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Consume protein from foods as close to nature as possible. Seafood, meat, poultry, eggs, legumes in moderation, and nuts and seeds. No need to avoid fatty meats. Strive for organic foods and non-CFO meats, as they will be far lower in toxins and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. (2015) Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Oils, up to 27 grams per day from olive oil or vegetable oils. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Consume extra virgin olive oil and avoid industrial seed oils. 2015 Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Consume no more than 10% of total calories from added sugars. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. Consume no more than 5% of total calories from added sugars. 2015 Dietary Guidelines Eating Pattern. Consume less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. Our recommended cyclical ketogenic eating pattern. You need more sodium while on a ketogenic diet. The range of sodium intake that most individuals on a ketogenic diet seem to thrive at resides between 4,000 and 6,000 milligrams. The American Heart Association does not recommend a specific ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, but as the premier official heart health organization in the U.S., they should, and ideally it would be no more than 4-to-1. That is, your diet should contain no more than 4 times as much omega-6 as omega-3. Additionally, the AHA recommendation to consume 5 to 10% of your total calories as linoleic acid should be scrapped and replaced by the far more accurate statement that you need only 0.5 to 2% of your total calories as LA. This is sufficient for essential physiological functions, and taking in much more than that might have adverse effects on your health, especially if you consume very little omega-3. The AHA should specify that omega-6 fats should come from whole foods, such as nuts, seeds, fish, and eggs, rather than from isolated oils extracted from corn, soybeans, cottonseeds, and other industrial sources. Replacing the high LA oils with extra virgin olive oil would also be a step in the right direction to reduce the risk of cardiovascular events and death. As the data from Japan showed, even when the usual diet was already high in omega-3, adding additional omega-3 led to reductions in major coronary events. This being the case, the AHA's current recommendation of 500 to 1,000 milligrams of EPA-DHA to prevent coronary events probably isn't high enough to provide optimal cardiovascular protection, particularly when Americans' diets are so high in omega-6. A more appropriate EPA-DHA recommendation for the general population would be to consume 2 to 4 grams per day, especially for those at high risk for CHD and those already living with it. Table 1.2 offers an outline of current AHA recommendations regarding omega-6 and omega-3, and recommendations that are better supported by the scientific evidence. Table 1.2 AHA recommendations regarding omega-6 and omega-3 intake. Current AHA recommendations: consume at least 5 to 10% of total calorie intake as omega-6. Evidence-based recommendations: linoleic acid as 0.5 to 2% of total calories is sufficient to support essential biological processes. An upper limit of linoleic acid as 3% of total calories is recommended to prevent enzymatic competition with omega-3 ALA and to reduce the synthesis of pro-inflammatory compounds. If EPA-DHA intake is optimized, then it might be acceptable to exceed this 3% recommended cap. In any case, linoleic acid should come from whole food sources. See below. Current AHA recommendations: consumption of industrial seed oils is promoted. Evidence-based recommendations. Avoid the consumption of industrial seed oils. Omega-6 should come from nuts, seeds, fish, eggs, poultry, etc. Current AHA recommendations. No advice given regarding the optimal dietary omega-6/3 ratio. Evidence-based recommendations. Consume an omega-6/3 ratio of no more than 4:1. Current AHA recommendations. Consume 500 milligrams EPA-DHA per day to prevent heart disease. Those with existing heart disease should consume 1,000 milligrams EPA-DHA. Evidence-based recommendations. Consume anywhere from 2 to 4 grams of EPA-DHA per day for the primary and secondary prevention of heart disease. However, the consumption of EPA-DHA should be treated or titrated in order to maintain an omega-3 index, EPA plus DHA in red blood cells, of at least 8% or more. Summary. Saturated fat was inappropriately demonized as the dietary culprit causing heart disease. This was based on the idea that saturated fats raise cholesterol and the flawed theory that higher cholesterol levels increase risk for CHD. The omega-6 fat linoleic acid found primarily in vegetable and seed oils, with only small amounts occurring in whole unprocessed foods, was mistakenly anointed as heart healthy, owing to 3 weak reasons. When people replace saturated fats in their diet with vegetable oils, their total cholesterol and LDL decrease. But remember, this happens only when omega-3 intake is low. Next reason. Research that included both omega-6 and omega-3 has been used to support the idea that omega-6 on its own is healthy. Last reason. Higher levels of linoleic acid in the blood are associated with lower CHD risk, but the level of linoleic acid in someone's blood doesn't automatically correspond to the amount of linoleic acid in their diet. Industrial seed oils are not nearly as healthy as they're purported to be. In fact, they are actively bad for you for these reasons. Industrial seed oils were not part of the human diet during the vast majority of our evolution. No population today with good health and longevity consumes them in large amounts. EPA and DHA have consistently been found to reduce the risk of mortality or major cardiac events, but only when omega-6 intake is low. Healthy populations such as in Japan and Italy typically have an omega-6/3 ratio of 4:1 or less, a ratio easily achieved on a diet of whole unprocessed foods, but virtually impossible when people consume seed oils and the processed foods that contain them. Recommendations to replace saturated fat with omega-6, especially when it comes from industrial seed oils, have likely increased the risk of heart disease and other chronic diseases. It's time to make the vegetable oils vanish and bring back the butter dish. Chapter 2. A Dangerous Transition, the Rise and Fall of Trans Fats. In Chapter 1, you learn how saturated fats were unfairly blamed for cardiovascular disease, but even with all those flawed studies, how exactly did vegetable oils manage to dethrone the mighty animal fat, a food mankind has consumed for millennia? The story is one of bad science, misinformation, and the devastating consequences of industrial food modification. It's a story that very few know and even fewer tell, but it's one we should never forget. Our tale begins in the laboratory of Wilhelm Norman, a German chemist. Norman's goal was to find a way to change liquid fats into a more stable and solid form, and his experiments proved to be a success. In 1901, Norman discovered that by using a catalyst and heat and adding hydrogen to liquid vegetable oil, it became a salad. At the time of his experiments, the high demand for animal fats like lard and butter was becoming difficult to meet, and while there was a growing supply of cheap byproduct vegetable oils from industrial manufacturing, they were not ideal for cooking. So when Norman figured out how to return these liquid oils, or how to turn these liquid oils into a shelf-stable, semi-solid fat, it was a pretty big deal. Norman guarded his discovery closely, choosing to patent it and share the news only with a few trusted colleagues. Little did he know that his discovery, what we call now trans fats, would set the stage for a global health catastrophe. In 1910, Procter & Gamble, having purchased the rights to Norman's patent in the U.S., used the technology to create the first commercially available, partially hydrogenated fat. We know it as Crisco, and it was hailed as a breakthrough. The science behind trans fat. Before we dive into this story any further, let's make a moment to discuss what exactly a trans fat is. As you learned earlier in this book, fats are made up largely of carbon atoms and hydrogen in a chain. The specific configuration of this chain will determine whether a fat is saturated, polyunsaturated, or monounsaturated. But there are also trans fats, and industrial trans fats is formed when liquid vegetable oil goes through an industrial process called partial hydrogenation, which adds hydrogen atoms to the fatty acids in a random way. The purpose of hydrogenation is to turn the polyunsaturated fat into a more stable saturated form, which gives it a semi-solid appearance and texture. But like many other industrial food processes, there is an unintended consequence, the creation of naturated fatty acids that your body simply doesn't recognize. Because the fat you consume later goes on to form the membranes around your body cells, trans fat can quite literally change you from the inside out. In other words, when you eat food that contains trans fat, the integrity and function of your cells are compromised. Worse yet, trans fat has a considerably long half-life, which means that you'll be stuck with it in your body for a long time. Sure, that blueberry pie with shortening might taste good, but it is worth having trans fat lodged into your brain cells, doing who knows what for months. One important thing to note is that there are natural trans fats that do not have the same risks as the artificial type. In fact, some research even suggests that the small amounts of cis trans fat whose hydrogen is arranged in an orderly way found in nature could have health benefits. For example, conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, is a trans fat that is naturally found in grass-fed animals and may have significant cancer-fighting properties. Transvasinic acid has even been studied for its ability to lower cholesterol levels. So, as you can see, the small amounts of natural trans fat found in whole foods aren't harmful and may even be beneficial. However, the same cannot be said for artificial industrial trans fat, which can cause cardiovascular disease. How exactly industrial trans fat causes heart disease is not well understood, but a few different theories have been proposed. Research suggests that trans fat can inhibit numerous biological functions, from preventing the synthesis of prostaglandin to inhibiting your body's ability to form long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Regardless of the exact mechanism, it's a well-established fact that trans fat causes heart disease, and there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that its negative effects are even more far-reaching than cardiovascular disease alone. Industrial trans fat has also been implicated in diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, neurological disorders, and even depression. But this was not always known. As you're about to find out, industrial trans fat in the form of partially hydrogenated oil was very popular through the 1900s, marketing that changed the world's diet. The development of Crisco was a success, but there was still one major obstacle Procter & Gamble needed to overcome: how to convince the world to give up time-honored animal fats for a tub of artificial shortening. Their strategy was simple, clever, and deceptive. They would target housewives who at the time performed most of the cooking for their family. Advertisements depicting happy housewives cooking meals for their happy families began popping up in women's magazines. Crisco was touted as a healthy cooking oil and better than butter. This marketing ploy went on for decades, making claims that Crisco was digestible, natural, and cheaper. Doctors and scientists were frequently used in the ads, which often insinuated that Crisco would make children grow up to be strong and happy. Strong elements of social influence were also used, with the ads proclaiming that everyone from grandma to little Johnny prefers pies made with Crisco. They also gave away a free cookbook with 250 recipes that, yes, you guessed it, all used Crisco. In fact, to people at the time, it would seem that there was no reason to choose anything but Crisco for cooking and baking. Foods so light and delicious that they'll appeal to everybody in the family, even those who have delicate digestion. Crisco, as your doctor knows, is the pure all-vegetable shortening that is so much lighter. 1938 print advertisement for Crisco. Procter & Gamble's marketing was a success, with 60 million pounds of Crisco sold in the year 1916 alone. Animal fat sales began to decline in favor of the partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil, and for a while Crisco remained unopposed. Margarine enters the food supply. Margarine, originally created from beef tallow, found its way into the United States from France in the late 1800s. Initially, margarine wasn't all that popular in the U.S. until manufacturers began to add polyunsaturated vegetable oils to the beef tallow and market it as a healthy butter alternative. This was not met kindly by the butter industry, whose protests resulted in statewide bans and harsh taxes on the production of margarine. According to protesters, margarine was a threat to traditional American dairy farms and butter itself. But despite these bans and heavy taxation, the margarine industry pushed on and adopted the fat hydrogenation process, eventually removing beef tallow in favor of a formula using entirely partially hydrogenated oils. There was one problem affecting margarine sales. It resembled a pale white chunk of wax, not exactly the most appetizing appearance. As a solution, margarine manufacturers decided to dye their product yellow, just like butter. The butter industry cried foul and petitioned to block the artificially dyed margarine from entering the food supply. The petition was a success, and for a time, margarine producers were banned from dyeing their product. Instead, they chose to sell margarine with a packet of artificial yellow dye that would allow consumers to do it themselves. Much of the butter industry's dismay, margarine wasn't going anywhere. The Depression and World War II. The popularity of partially hydrogenated fats grew exponentially during the Great Depression and later World War II. The Great Depression, which took place between 1929 to 1939, was an economic crisis that led to worldwide poverty. Many of those who still use animal fats in cooking were forced to switch to the more affordable partially hydrogenated vegetable oils instead. Things got even worse when World War II began, as the need for food conservation became a must. Glycerol, a clear liquid derived from fat, was in high demand for bomb making, and the U.S. government requested that all households donate their excess fat. Between the shortages and required rationing, people around the world were forced to rely on partially hydrogenated oil instead of animal fats.